Now, hi, and welcome to the latest Office of Neighborhood Coordination's virtual lunch and learn session on making meetings work. For those of you who I have not met, who are attendees, I'm Vanessa Baca. I'm the manager of the Office of Neighborhood Coordination. I want to welcome all of our attendees. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend this training. This has been a topic that's been of great interest to many of our neighborhood associations citywide. I think we all know sometimes running meetings can be a challenge. It can be a challenge to, get everybody on the same page. It can be a challenge getting people to attend. And occasionally, it can be a challenge for people who are at the meeting to kind of find common ground. So I'm very pleased that Dr. Rudy Garcia can share his expertise with us. Rudy, I will turn the training over to you.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate the opportunity to offer the workshop. And thank you to all the participants who have joined us this morning. I'm going to go ahead and get the share screen started here so we can, let's see, can everybody see that? Is everybody there?
I don't think they can, they can't talk, but I think they can talk, they can type into the chat. I did want to remind everybody, sorry, I forgot to do this before. We'll go ahead and let Dr. Garcia go through his presentation. And then if there are any questions, I ask that the attendees please type them into the chat. I will ask the questions at the end of Dr. Garcia's presentation. And then if there are any other unanswered questions, that will be an opportunity to ask them then. So just wanted to remind everybody about that. So Dr. Garcia, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Vanessa, you can see that, correct?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I have two screens, and so I just want to make sure one of them blinked out on me. So I just want to make sure it was still up there. Well, great. Yes. Thank you. Let's go ahead and get started. The session I wanted to do today is called Making Meetings Work. And as Vanessa said, meetings are so important in what we do in our lives today and at work, at home. And it's very important for neighborhood associations because all of you are hosting board meetings, all of you are hosting association meetings. And so what I wanted to do today was just provide you with a few tools that you can add to your meeting toolbox so that it's a little bit easier for you to host and manage a meeting. And God knows I've attended a lot of meetings. Career-wise, I've had a variety of different careers. I recently retired, when I say recently, in 2017 from C&M after 27 years as Dean of Students and as an instructor there. And so I hosted a lot of meetings. I oversaw a lot of community programs that required meeting with a variety of partners, a variety of neighborhood associations, a variety of government entities. And what I put into this workshop are things that I think you'll find very good for you to run a meeting. It's also part of the Leadership Plenty program that I do through my consulting business, where I teach a variety of different community folks how to run and manage meetings. So let's dive into it. Let's talk a little bit about, well, let's see. Sorry, it looks like for some reason I'm going to click and get back to the start here. My apologies. Okay, let's get you back started. There we go. I have this quote by Margaret Wheatley on here. There is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about, because all of you are in your neighborhood associations because you care about your community. I know I'm in my neighborhood association because I care about my community. I've always thought as neighborhood associations being communities within the greater community of Albuquerque. And we all care so much about our communities that we all work for any positive change we can that's going to improve our lives in our communities. And when we're doing that, we're usually hosting meetings or running meetings. So henceforth the quote that I put up there. What I want to do with our objectives today is, it's not a lot. This shouldn't take more than maybe 45 minutes, 50 minutes with some Q&A, is answer some of these questions. Why do meetings fail? I think that's important to know beforehand, before knowing what makes for a good meeting. Identify purposes for holding meetings, identifying techniques for holding productive meetings, and then a summary. So we're going to go through about 25 slides answering these questions and hopefully achieving all these objectives. But first, I'd like to start, and we can do this through the chat room. I'd just be curious for you to just write down, and like I said, you could do it through the chat room. I'd like to know if you could give me an example of a good meeting you attended, what made it good, just out of curiosity. if anybody wants to write anything down. I'm looking at the chat box now.
And what I can do, Rudy, is I can read them to you, so you're
Okay,
not having to interrupt your presentation.
Okay, sure. So, and on the other end of that, also write down an example of a bad meeting and what made it challenging. And I don't mind waiting just a few minutes here to hear if anything pops up, because I think oftentimes we don't. When I've asked this to a lot of folks that I've been doing the workshop to, a lot of people can quickly give me an example of a bad meeting, but sometimes people find it very difficult to give me an example of a good meeting. And so I've always been curious how when people are able to give me an example of a good meeting, what it was that made it good. And it's probably going to fall into this presentation today, some of the things, some of the tools that I'm going to give you that makes it for a good meeting. So I'm going to go ahead and move on here while people maybe write something down. Okay. Now let's look at what causes meetings to fail. There are usually two factors that cause meetings to fail. One of them is a misunderstanding between participants, and the other one is the inability to make decisions about important matters. Looking at number one, I have 3 subpoints there. And those 3 subpoints about misunderstanding between participants usually involves different personal and cultural experiences, which I've experienced in meetings, alternate views of desired outcomes, and personal agendas. Points A and B are easily managed by using the tools I'm going to show you today. Point C can also be managed by using the tools I'm going to show you today, but requires a little bit more attention. When somebody comes in with a personal agenda, sometimes that can be, one, it can catch you off guard if you're not prepared for it. And 2, sometimes it can sabotage the entire meeting and create chaos. And so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about personal agendas. And then point number 2, the inability to make decisions about important matters. I have been in meetings where the purpose was to make a decision on a subject or a topic. And because the meeting got hijacked by a personal agenda, we never achieved it. And so no decisions were made. Or maybe it didn't get hijacked. It just never went anywhere because we kind of went left, we went right, we went up and down. And the meeting may not have been run or managed well to where a decision could have made that day. And keep in mind, when I'm talking about meetings, all our time is important. Your time is important. My time is important. When you're running a meeting, the people who are attending it, their time is important. There's nothing worse than spending a lot of time doing nothing in a meeting that's going to get people upset and maybe not want to come back to any future meetings. That's why it's so important. You're going to hear me talk about how to manage a meeting and how to set it up and be prepared for it so that you know how to deal with points 1 and 2, and you know how to deal with the personal agendas, and you know how to make a meeting successful so that you're not wasting anybody's time. One of the things I've heard from my colleagues very often is when we come out of a meeting, God, that meeting was a waste of time. We could have done that via email. We could have done that on the phone. So that's what I'm trying to do today, is hopefully teach you through a series of points here that meetings are good and can be good if they're properly prepared for. Now, in what I said earlier, we know that people come to meetings with a general idea of the purpose, but with a lifetime of different experiences, perceptions, and attitudes. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And as you see in the bottom bullet, it's not a surprise when there's a clash of opinions or different ideas. It's how we manage those opinions and ideas that can help a meeting move forward and be successful. So there's nothing wrong with different experiences per se. Actually, I appreciate a diverse group of people. And I mean, I appreciate them bringing in different experiences and different attitudes and perceptions. Where it can become difficult is when they bring in negative attitudes or negative perceptions that can cause the meeting to fail. Our job as meeting preparers or as meeting chairs or as facilitators is to be as prepared as possible to manage a meeting so that people can feel comfortable in sharing of ideas and being able to know that this, whatever the meeting is for, whatever the purpose that they came into it, we're comfortable with it and left being comfortable with it. So misunderstanding between participants, as I said earlier, it is natural and predictable to have a clash of opinions or different ideas at the meetings. What you're going to see here in the next couple of slides is there are going to be tools that you're going to learn to help groups get over the bumpy time so that meetings don't become gripe sessions for individuals or a lot of talk and no action. I've I've been involved in a lot of neighborhood association meetings where I have seen situations where they become gripe sessions for neighbors, or they become something where there's a lot of talk, but nothing comes out of the meeting. And nobody's at fault for this because, as I'll say, oftentimes when we're involved with neighborhood associations, we're on the board or we're members in a subcommittee. For many people, they're not trained on how to manage groups of people. They're not trained on how to manage a meeting, or they're not trained maybe on the dynamics of Robert's Rules of Orders or the bylaws. And so they're just good people trying to do good things by volunteering to help make their communities better. So no one can be faulted for some of these things. But by training ourselves and learning more how to run a meeting, you're going to have greater success. One thing I will say up front is that what we don't want to happen in a meeting is let our emotions overtake our logic. I have been in meetings where emotions start to bubble over. And so you have people who are angry, people who are shouting, and logic has left the door. And all of a sudden the meeting becomes an emotional bubble of just angst, and it doesn't go anywhere. And that's sad because if that emotion had been managed well enough, and the manager of the meeting had really been watching the stakeholders coming in and monitoring it, it maybe would not have gotten as far as what I've seen sometimes. Let's talk a little bit about personal agendas. These when people come in personal agendas, this is the term I use, is they're meeting hijackers. They're coming in to hijack your meeting. And so what happens, as you can see on the bulleted point here, is when a person comes into the meeting with their own axe to grind, it can disrupt it. It derails the meeting for the issue at hand and for other issues to come, because it disrupts the process. It makes you as the meeting manager uncomfortable, makes other people uncomfortable. And you'll see the little graphic there, when personal agendas become more important than the team and the overreaching arching mission success, performance suffers and failure ensues. One thing that I always tried to do when I was managing or running a meeting is, one, I always invited stakeholders that I knew had to be at the meeting. Two, I always tried to make sure I was clear on what the purpose of the meeting was. Three, I had agendas, I had ground rules, I had everything you're going to learn about here in place. But I was always prepared should somebody come in with a personal agenda. Sometimes in neighborhood association meetings, you're going to have people who may do that, come in with a personal agenda, because it's something they want to be brought forth and heard. And maybe they didn't go to your board president to talk about it. Maybe they didn't follow the proper channel. So we just have to be prepared for those kind of situations. And so what I wanted to do is, one of my jobs at C&M that I did for 11 years is I was a dean of students. And as dean of students, my job, I always considered my job to be a behavior modification specialist. My job was to keep 6 campuses in Albuquerque safe, and to keep faculty, students, and staff safe, and to also ensure that students had their right to due process. But my job was to really monitor behavior. And I saw a lot of behaviors in my time there. At that time, C&M had about 32,000 students, so it was a small city within a city. But here's some things I've seen with people who come to a meeting with personal agendas. And in my case, I saw it in students who came to a meeting with me, usually a disciplinary meeting, where I was trying to be as nice and professional as possible. But here's some of the behaviors that I would see. Often they would be poor listeners. And that's because they tend to want to listen to themselves more than listen to what others are saying. They tend to be repetitive. Sometimes they'll make personal accusations, and they might try to exercise power and domination. I have seen that in some meetings where somebody with a personal agenda will come in very loud and boisterous and try to dominate the meeting. They could they're trying to turn attention to the problem they have, trying to win the people at the meeting over to their issue. They might take issue with everything. Yes, Rudy, I know you're trying to have this meeting about this, but this is what we need to talk about. Yes, Rudy, I know you have an agenda, but this is, so they're monopolizing in some cases. They could question the reason for the meeting and the direction it's taking. And in some cases, they may leave the meeting if it doesn't go their way. I've had people get up and walk out of meetings. I've seen that happen. And it's sad, because if there was a civil way, not if the interaction with a person who is exhibiting these type of behaviors was conducted in a civil way, odds are that both parties would be shaking hands and they'd feel heard. But sometimes their own behavior doesn't allow them to be heard because their own behavior is creating a situation where it's very difficult to have a civil conversation with them unless you do it at a later point. So when we talk about personal agendas, they are going to happen. It is going to, if it hasn't already happened in some meetings you've been in. And the sad part about this is I have seen meeting chairs where things like this happen and they don't know what to do and they kind of back away and then the meeting kind of gets a little bit out of hand because there's no more management of it. And it turns into the person's who has the personal agenda, their meeting. And that's wrong. For the other attendees that are there and for the board members that are there, that's why you have agendas. So I wanted to bring this up so that you had an idea of maybe some of the behaviors with these folks. The other point as to why meetings fail is the inability to make decisions about important matters. Lack of action can derail meetings. I've always been an advocate that no matter what the purpose of your meeting, you should always have an action component to that meeting. Even if the meeting is nothing more than to meet new neighbors and introduce yourselves, you should have an action component to that. Maybe the action component is at the end of this meeting, we will have 5 new neighbors that we have met and will be able to help us on subcommittees. You should have an agenda and discussion with appropriate action to allow the meeting to stay on course. So this is one of the big things where I have often have people tell me, hey, a meeting that I went to wasn't a good meeting because it was supposed to be a decision on goals and objectives, but we never got there. And we spent an hour and a half to 2 hours talking about personal lives and everything else, but goals and objectives. So no decision was made. And people get frustrated with that. Like I said, we all have time. Our time is important. And as volunteers and neighborhood associations, our time is extremely important because we have other lives that we're involved in, whether we're working full time or we're retired or we're spending time with our family. We all have things that we're doing that having a good meeting is important so that we can accomplish things and not necessarily not accomplish anything. So what I want to do with the toolbox is introduce you to a couple things about making meetings work. This is the core of what we're going to be talking about here. And in your toolbox, this is what you should have. You should always identify a purpose for your meeting. I have been invited to meetings before with a variety of entities. It could be governmental, it could be corporate, it could be non-for-profits, it could be neighborhood associations. And sometimes I'm asked to attend a meeting, but I'm not really given the reason what the meeting is about. So I have to probe a little bit. I'll ask, what's the purpose of the meeting? Sometimes I'll get an answer, oh, this meeting is because we want to talk about crime in this section of the neighbor. Okay. Well, can you give me a little bit more clarity? Other times, well, we're just wanting to meet right now. I'm not sure why the purpose of the meeting, but I thought it'd be good to bring people together to get to know each other. Well, okay, if it's get to know each other, but what do we get to know each other for? Purpose of the meeting is extremely important. Identifying your stakeholders is another key criteria here. Now, in a neighborhood association, your stakeholders are going to be the people within the boundaries of your neighborhood association. It could be a business, it could be residential, it could be an apartment complex. Those are your stakeholders. In other meetings, like for example, I host a lot of meetings between government offices and nonprofits and faith-based organizations. Oftentimes, depending on what the purpose I'm trying to meet and the goal I'm trying to meet, oftentimes that determines who my stakeholders are that I'm going to invite. It's very important for me to make sure I invite the right people. You want to have a clear and complete agenda. Here's where the agenda, there are a couple of critical things that I've always said a meeting needs to have. 1 is purpose, 2 is agenda, and 3 is ground rules. Those are 3 things that any meeting in order for success should have. The other component to that is a meeting is only as good as the people hosting it. In this case, your neighborhood association. If you and the board are hosting a meeting is only going to be as good as you and the board. If you have an agenda, ground rules, and a purpose for the meeting, but you're not adhering to that, then your meeting, you're not doing a good job in managing that meeting. And I've seen that sometimes people have an agenda and ground rules. They don't enforce the ground rules. People are getting out of hand. The agenda goes left. because the meeting hijackers have hijacked the meeting. The responsibility is always going to be on the meeting host or a group that's hosting that meeting. In this case, if you're a neighborhood association, I'm going to say it's the board. The board needs to be responsible for ensuring that that meeting has a purpose, that meeting has an agenda, and there's ground rules. And as you see here, the other thing that often pops up when I ask people what makes for a bad meeting is they say it never started on time and it ended late. There have been times I've been in a meeting where they say it's going to go from 6 to 8 o'clock. And I'm sitting there, and the meeting's not going according to the agenda, and it's going left, right, up, down, forward. And I'm looking at the clock, and come 7:45, we've not accomplished the first 5 agenda items. And so you'll hear the meeting person say, folks, I'm so sorry, but we're going to keep going here if that's okay. And we may end up going till 9:30, 10 o'clock. Usually I'll say, I'm sorry, but my time is important. And you had 6 to 8. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to leave. And I'll leave, because if I've set my time from 6 to 8, I've set it from 6 to 8. I may have other things I'm doing after 8. I really think people need to hold true to that, start and end on time. Here's one thing I see very often is you may have a neighbor association meeting and the board is saying, oh, you know what? We're going to start this meeting like so-and-so's not here yet, but yet 50 of your neighbors are there and they've arrived on time. And my philosophy is you don't start a meeting late because one person's not there. That's so important. And maybe it's a very important person. Maybe it's I don't know, somebody you've invited to speak on behalf of a certain issue and they're running late. And that's okay. You don't start the meeting late till they get there. Maybe you continue with the other agenda items. And when that person gets there, you put them in. It doesn't matter who they are and how important they are, but maybe you make that clear to them. I'm a huge believer you start and end on time. The next bullet is you value the ground rules. And we'll be talking about ground rules. Ground rules are basically the rules that you set for the behavior of everyone in that meeting. Now keep in mind, ground rules are only as important as the people who have bought into them and the person or the group of people who enforce them. Okay. They mean nothing if you set up ground rules and you're not enforcing them. We'll talk about ground rules here shortly. I live by ground rules in a lot of my meetings, and I don't hesitate to enforce them. Matter of fact, before I start a meeting, I will typically say, folks, here are the ground rules for the meetings. I expect everybody to adhere to them. If you are having an issue with these ground rules, feel free to talk to me at a break. If you're having an issue with the ground rules during the meeting and you're not really to adhere to them, I may stop the meeting, we'll take a break, and I may ask you to maybe, and I'll do this in private, but I may have to ask you to leave, or what's the issue with the ground rules, but you have to enforce the ground rules. I have never seen anybody get angry with ground rules, and I've never seen anybody typically ignore the ground rules. What I have seen is people's cell phones going off, and if you have a ground rule that says cell phones shouldn't be going off, maybe you just emphasize that, folks. I just want to reemphasize bullet number 9 on the ground rules, and that cell phones should be silenced. And if you have to take call, do it outside. Worst case scenario I've seen is people taking cell phone calls in the middle of a meeting talking, and it's hard for other people to hear. To me, that's rude and inconsiderate. You want to include meeting minutes. You should always have a scribe or a person to help write down your minute meetings. And that's important because I know in my neighborhood association, we have a secretary who writes down the minutes, and then we send them out after we approve them. We typically send them out about a week after the meeting, so everybody in the neighborhood association has a chance to see the minutes and what was spoken about at that meeting. The next bullet, balanced process.
I just
Yes.
wanted to add a suggestion
Sure.
for people for keeping records at neighborhood meetings.
Sure.
A lot of neighborhood folks that I communicate with have said that they utilize recording devices, which makes keeping notes a lot easier. I just wanted to throw that out as a possible way to do it instead of having to write by hand, which I know sometimes can be challenging for people if there's a lot going on. Sometimes it's useful to record on your phone, and then you can type out the minutes from those
Sure.
recordings.
Sure. Thank you, Vanessa. I'm glad
Sure.
you said that. In our digital world, that makes perfect sense. Matter of fact, I think our secretary will sometimes use a recorder, even though she's writing down the minutes, she'll sometimes use a recorder to make sure she hasn't missed anything. So thank you for that input. I appreciate that. You can tell I'm still old school when it comes to meetings, and taking the minutes. But you're right. Sometimes that can be very difficult to catch everything. And it's funny because I don't like being the minute taker because I'm a person that will sometimes say, okay, I'm sorry, what did you say? Let me make sure I got this down right. So yes, having a recorder is important to do. Matter of fact, our secretary has bought, I think the board bought her a little, it's a little Sony recorder. They're not expensive, about $30. You can plug it into your computer and play back. And she just wants to make sure she catches everything. So thank you for that input, Vanessa. The next bullet is balancing process and product interest. A lot of people ask me, what do you mean by that? Essentially, there are two types of people. They're process people and they're product people. Process people are more interested in how the meeting was run. They're more interested in the fairness of the meeting, how people were involved, how people were, the dialogues that went place. Product people are more the type of, hey, let's get moving on this objective. Let's meet our goals. Let's get things accomplished. So that's just you're going to have both types in your meetings, and you just really, if you've had enough neighborhood association meetings, you do get to know a lot of the neighbors that come to your meetings, and you'll get to recognize maybe who's a balance, who's a process person and who's a product person. You can easily balance both groups in a meeting. I tend to be a mixture of both. If I know it's going to be multiple meetings to achieve a goal, then I'm more of a process. Let's use a good process to come to a final conclusion on this goal. If it's a short meeting to accomplish something, then I'm more of the product person. Okay, here's the objectives. Let's discuss, let's meet them right away so we can move forward. And then the last bullet is include a meeting evaluation checklist. That's a handout that I sent to you, or that Vanessa sent to you, that allows you to kind of use a checklist when you're doing meetings to see if you're doing well enough with it. If you look at my graphic on the right, it's just additional points to making meetings work to add in your toolbox. Set the purpose or the objective for your meeting, inviting the right people as your stakeholders. Declare what type of meeting you're having. Is it a general meeting? Is it a bylaws meeting? That's important. The agenda is always going to be important to include in your meeting invitation so people have an idea of what is going to be covered. Okay, taking your notes, taking the minutes. And as Vanessa very well added, that having a recorder is really good. There's the start on time and an end on time. You're going to see this in so many things. You always want to start and end on time. I can't tell you how many times I've been in meetings where that doesn't happen and people just start to leave if it's not ending on time. Establish meeting norms. That's your ground rules, essentially. And if you look at number 8, stay focused. I've seen a lot of people who are running a meeting, if it's a board president or a vice president, another officer, they get distracted because somebody is going off point and they lose their focus. And you want to stay, that's why you have an agenda, help you stay on focus. Set an action plan. What action do you wish to accomplish after this meeting based on what the meeting's about? You can assign responsibility, set up subcommittees. A lot of neighborhood associations I've worked with sometimes have asked me, hey, how do you set up a subcommittee? How do you make these things work? I've been on several neighborhood associations here in Albuquerque. I'm a native. And the one that I'm on now, we actually have we have set up subcommittees. Most recently, last year, we set up a subcommittee to support Washington Middle School after the shooting they had there. And that subcommittee was made up of not just me as a board member, but also I asked several neighbors who would be interested in being on that board. We became a subcommittee to develop ideas on how we could support the school so we could present it back to the board. And so we very often will ask neighbors to serve on subcommittees. And it doesn't even have to be a board member chairing a subcommittee. It could be a neighbor chairing the subcommittee. And then follow up before and after the meeting. Follow-up is going to be crucial so that people aren't left with, well, what happened with what we discussed in that meeting? So making meetings work in that toolbox. Let's talk about the purpose. It's really, really critical that you communicate this clearly before you host the meeting or having the meeting. What is the purpose of this meeting? What is going to happen here? You should define a realistic scope to ensure that the group makes progress. Excuse me. When I say a realistic scope, I've seen people put 30 items on an agenda when you know that you have an hour-long meeting and you're thinking you're not going to achieve these 30 points, these objectives in 1 hour. You're just not. You have to be realistic about what you can do in that time frame you have for that meeting. And personally, people have asked me, hey, meetings, how long should meetings be? It's a tough question to answer because it's really dependent upon what your purpose of the meeting is. Most of my meetings are an hour long, an hour to two, depending on what we're discussing. If we're discussing some heavy topics, for example, if I'm having a meeting with, say, a government entity and a nonprofit and a faith-based organization to discuss, I don't know, emergency preparedness in the Southeast Heights of the city, my meetings might be an hour and a half long, and I might have 5 meetings to achieve my final goal. And so and also it's dependent upon what time of day you're doing this. Evening meetings, if you're having people coming after work to a meeting, 6 to 10 o'clock, a 4-hour meeting it's probably not going to be conducive to success. Most neighborhood association meetings that I've seen run about an hour to 2 hours. It varies. Some associations are now doing in-person Zoom, so everybody gets the opportunity to participate a little bit better, but you're going to have to decide what's best for the purpose of your meeting as to how long that meeting is going to be. Now, some meeting purposes, I've just threw some out there. Some of them are you getting acquainted. Purpose of the meeting is get acquainted, introduce people to each other, share information about each other's work. Some other purposes might be learning about different perspectives people have about an issue, generating ideas about how a problem could be solved, developing specific plans to address an issue, making decisions about specific work to undertake, money to allocate. There's another handout that at the end, I'll talk about the handouts, but there's another handout that I have for this section. And the handout for this one is really nothing different than the slide, maybe a point or two extra on there. Okay. Identifying your stakeholders. Okay. In its purest form, stakeholders, anyone has something gain or lose from the work of a group. In your case, neighborhood association, it's your association, your neighbors, the people within the boundaries of your neighborhood association, your businesses, et cetera. When deciding who to include to a meeting, just some questions to ask. Who stands to lose or gain something as a result of our efforts? Have we tried to include all possible stakeholders in the meetings? Is our group representative of our community defined by you? So do you have good representation? Some of you live in large, your boundaries of your neighbor association are large, and they include commercial, retail, nonprofits, faith-based organizations, residential, rental. So you have a lot of potential stakeholders you can invite to your neighborhood association meetings. Now let's move to another point and in another tool in your toolbox. Let's talk about the agenda. This is one of those 3 points I was telling you about: the agenda, the ground rules, and the purpose of the meeting. The agenda is that essential guide to keep a group moving towards its goals. It can reduce conflict as they are the written scope of work to be accomplished in the time period during which the effort will be made. When a group follows an agenda, everybody's time is used productively. That 4th bullet, I am a big believer that agendas can help prevent meeting hijack. The agenda is your roadmap, per se, to your meeting. Where are you going to start? Where are you going to go? And where are you going to stop? And on the right side, I've added, because a lot of times, and I put this in, it may seem very basic, and I'm sure many of you know the term agenda. Many of you have used agendas, but I still get a lot of people who ask me, hey, what's an agenda? And can you give me an example of one? The 2 handouts that Vanessa sent you, I did write up 2 different agendas, one for a new group, one for an established group. But agendas typically include time, date, location of the meeting, the purpose of the meeting, discussion topics, action items, new old business, and then adjournment. Our neighbor association agenda, we usually have call to order, the typical approval of the previous meeting's minutes. Then we'll have board reports. Board, and before the board reports, we'll have APD provide their report. And then I provide my report for safety patrol and any other safety issues within the neighborhood. We have the treasurer provide a treasurer report. We have the membership report. And then we have any topics of discussion that will follow by that, and then new and old business, and then adjournment. Our agendas will typically go out at least a week before the meeting. They're pretty straightforward, but it's a nice roadmap for our board president to follow And it's a nice way for if somebody wants to hijack your meeting, you can always defer back to, hey, Rudy, I know you're very, very passionate about this topic that is not on the agenda, the topic you're talking about. But let's put it, there's a term I use, let's put it in the parking lot. In the parking lot, some of you have heard that phrase. It's used very often in the world of work. You could use the little sticky pads. You can just put it over on your table or board and say, look, I'm going to write it down. And so you and I can discuss this issue after the meeting. You can email me, we can call, and we'll follow up on it and see if maybe it needs to be on the next board meeting agenda. So that's what I call the parking lot. So your agenda is really you're telling that person, hey, I hear what you're saying, but this is we won't be able to discuss it at this time on this agenda, but it's important enough to talk about, maybe discuss on a future agenda. So the agendas are really, really, really important for you to pay attention to. Planning the meeting. This is another area where sometimes it's hard as a neighborhood association, because I think many of you have meetings in community centers, in some cases maybe at a park. It's not an indoor location. Some cases, I think the public library, but you want to consider the best time to schedule a meeting. Most neighborhood associations I know have their meetings at 6 p.m. Some I know have done a 5 p.m. meeting, but a lot of people who are working till 5 may not make that meeting on time. You want to schedule adequate time to address each agenda item. You want to rely on ground rules. We'll talk about ground rules here shortly to manage presenters or discussions that exceed the allotted time. You want to honor everybody's time. That's important. Consider the location of the meeting. If your location is at ours in our neighborhood, we can actually walk to our location. You can drive, but within the neighborhood boundaries, it's such an easy walk. You want to consider the room size, comfort, accessibility, and seating capacity. Are their chairs comfortable? Are they not comfortable? Is it going to be a really cold room or a very hot room? And accessibility, are folks who have accessibility issues, are they able to get into the room? Very important. The lighting, heating and cooling, the acoustics and possible noise issues. And as I said, if you're in an outside area by a park, that's hard to, you're in a city park, it's going to be hard to control the acoustics or any noise issues or even the heating and cooling issue on that. And have you provided plenty of advance notice? There's nothing worse than you're scheduling a meeting and you let people know, I don't know, a day, maybe 5 hours before the meeting that there's a meeting. And once again, people have planned their days, their weeks, their schedules. I own my own business, so my schedule fills up fairly fast, and I can't at the spur of the moment go to a meeting that I'm not aware of in an hour or two. I really need to have some time to know and schedule for a meeting.
Rudy, I
Now,
wanted just
yeah,
to interject here really quickly. A lot
sure.
of neighborhood associations will use their neighborhood sign as a way to give
Correct,
advance
correct.
notice of a meeting. They can do that for their annual meeting. And the annual meeting is required to be noticed at least 2 weeks in advance.
Good,
But
good.
some other thoughts of how to notice the meeting: people can utilize social media, you can use flyers, you can use email or text messages or phone calls. Um, you can put a notice if you have a newsletter, you can use that. You can
Mhm.
use Nextdoor. I just wanted to give people, let them know that there are a variety of options of ways that you can give advance notice, not just of your annual meeting, but of any kind of meeting that you're having.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. I'm glad you said that, because as you drive around town, you're right. I'll see very often on the signs that people have for their neighborhood associations, next meeting, such and such time. We use something called the HCNA alert, which is an email blast that goes out, advertise the meeting time. Our newsletter will advertise it. Oftentimes, if I'm doing a safety patrol and I'm talking to various neighbors, I will let them know, hey, by the way, don't forget there's a NA meeting next Wednesday at 7 p.m. The nice thing with our meetings is we have always kept them the second Wednesday of each month, the same time. So almost everybody now knows that every second Wednesday of the month, we will have the meeting at that time. But Vanessa, thank you for that input. And that's important for you all to know. There are so many venues for you to advertise your meeting and promote it for people to know, especially in our electronic digital world. There are so many different ways. Where it can be a little hard sometimes is when you have those big neighbor associations with lots of homes. But like I said, if you can manage to do ours is called the HCNA alert, where a person manages it and they're able to put the information on there and shoot it out to people who have signed up for it. But that's not the only thing we depend on. We, as Vanessa said, the newsletters, other forms of email, and then board members just basically letting folks know about it as well. Let's talk about ground rules. This is the other component that I was telling you about that you should always have for a meeting. They encompass that agreement for group members to make about how they'll relate to each other. And they provide for civility and order in a meeting. Now, the third bullet, this is the only thing. They are only as good as those who have designed and developed them and enforce them. I use the word enforce, that's a strong word, but are behind them. Now, you could do ground rules in a variety of different ways. As a neighborhood association at a meeting, you might say, hey, folks, we'd like to develop ground rules for all our meetings. So let's spend 15 minutes here coming up with some ground rules so everybody has buy-in. You could do it as a board. Ground rules are really what you decide should be important for you to follow. I just threw something up here on the right that's very generic. On ground rules, be concise, stay on topic is number 3. There's the parking lot I was talking to you about. And I like number 3 because be concise, staying on topic. Sometimes a person can go off topic, and sometimes we're being nice and we allow them to maybe stay off topic because we're being polite, nice, and they go on for 10 minutes. That could be a ground rule. Be concise, stay on topic. Everybody will be allowed to speak for 3 minutes maximum. No disruptions, phone, email, text, side conversations. You know what I see oftentimes in meetings is people talking while somebody else is talking. And it's hard. It's not fair for the other people who are trying to listen. And sometimes I've been in a meeting and I'll hear somebody talking and I'll be very polite, say, please, I'm trying to hear what the speaker is saying. Do you mind taking your conversation outside? Or maybe not having it. Most of the time, people are very polite and they stop talking, or they'll go outside and talk. Hey, that's fine with me too. But I'm just trying to be cordial and civil about, look, guys, we have some ground rules here. Let's adhere to them. Okay. Demonstrate mutual respect, no negative criticisms, number 7. Sometimes I've seen meetings where they start out pretty good, but then the negative criticism pops up. Nobody says, hey, we have ground rules. Remember, no negative criticism. And it just keeps going on and on and on and on. And I'm a believer in, hey, I respect your opinion, but I'm also a big believer in that, look, is this going to be a gripe session or is this going to be a meeting where we're going to try and meet the agenda goals and see what we can come up with here? Because if it's a gripe session, then I'll set that up. I don't mind having another meeting where all it is, the purpose is to gripe. Hey, if that's what you want, that's what we'll do. And believe it or not, I've actually had a gripe meeting where people felt really good afterwards. And that's all we did for an hour is it was a gripe session. The agenda was gripe about this, gripe about this, gripe about this. But I made it clear, we're not going to talk poorly of anybody. If you have a gripe about weeds in the median, then hey, that's what we'll talk about. But that's very important to have as part of your ground rules. And you see number 10, have fun, use humor, not at anybody else's expense. I do like humor, and I do like having fun. And meetings don't have to be very serious. You can have some joy and you can have some fun with it. But like I said, not at the expense of others, because that's not what you want. Now, meeting minutes, as Vanessa had mentioned earlier, whether you use a recorder or you have somebody taking the minutes, all you're doing is recording the activity that occurs during the meeting. Okay, you're creating a memory of the group's discussion. So you can, a person to be the scribe, record the minutes, or they could use a recorder. Now, the one thing with the recorder, though, you want to make sure if you're going to use it, make sure you test it beforehand, make sure the batteries are charged, make sure that, because I have been in meetings where somebody was using a recorder, not writing anything down, and they didn't realize the battery had died about a minute into it. So for the hour meeting, nothing was recorded. So that's the only thing I would suggest is if you're going to use a recorder, make sure you back up battery, make sure somebody knows how to use it. They're not using it for the first time in that meeting, because some of these little digital recorders can be a little hard to use. So that's the only advice I would give you for that. The meeting minutes should include what the group decided, how they decided it, decisions made, those responsible for carrying them out. And what I like about minutes is it kind of gives you a sense of accomplishment because you can see the work that was done in that meeting. So it kind of gives you a little bit of the history of the work done and met. Okay. Here's the process and product interests I was talking about earlier. Process people tend to concentrate on the group interactions and dynamics. They're more of the, hey, how is this flowing? How is the interaction between people taking place? Is there fairness in the decision-making process? Process people tend to be more of a consensus type person, where consensus doesn't mean that, hey, consensus basically is everybody agrees to agree. You have a fair process, everybody got to put in their input, and everybody voted on it knowing that they were involved in the input. Product people tend to be probably more of the, because they're interested in accomplishing objectives and developing deadlines, more of the majority rules type folks, where you've been in those meetings where, hey, we're going to decide on this, all in favor, thumbs up, hands up, yay, all against nay, boom, you move on. So you just, you want to, when you're looking at meetings, you want to just look at process product people. My hope is that when you start, if you're not hosting meetings and you're starting to host meetings, get to know the people who are coming to your meetings, your stakeholders. If you've already been having meetings and you're a pro at it, there's nothing wrong with just to get to know your attendees a little bit more. Know who they are. What do they bring to the table? What do they bring to the meeting? Are they process or product people, or are they a mixture of both? They don't have to be one or the other. Okay. Have a meeting evaluation checklist. This is another handout that Vanessa sent you that I created for y'all. And that's just nothing more than a checklist of things that you might want to look at. The evaluation checklist I gave you is something you can use after a meeting or even before a meeting. Like here, you have before, during, and after. You could use a checklist to help a meeting chair establish a successful meeting. It can be used to train new meeting chairs. It's a good evaluation tool for a meeting debrief. So the checklist is nice. It's a nice way for you to say, okay, how was the heating, cooling? How was this lighting? How was this room? How was accessibility? Just various things that you can go back and look at, so that I've always said, evaluate your meeting so that you can have a good meeting the next time, or a better meeting. Now, as we get towards the end of the presentation here, let's look at some tips for the meeting chair. Do set up the ground rules and enforce them. I can't help but really emphasize that ground rules are so critical, but they have to be enforced. They have to be adhered to. Okay, do set up a agreed upon decision-making process. You just heard me mention majority versus consensus. Most neighborhood associations tend to go majority vote because it's a little quicker. Consensus takes a little bit more time, and it takes a little bit more training for people to work through a consensus. Usually it involves a facilitator to get a group of people to move from point A to point B, point C, point D, and agree to agree. Hey, be prepared for the meeting. Know what is expected to be accomplished, know who's attending. I've been in meetings where the meeting chair is kind of lost. Oh, let me see here. And we're spending time because they weren't prepared. Okay. Keep the process moving, keep the group focused on the agenda. Once again, start on time, end on time. Always try to do that. Don't show favoritism. Okay. Do not criticize, debate, argue, or dominate the conversation. Don't push the process too quickly. Don't ignore those ground rules. You can't. And do not ignore conflict. Address conflict, whether it's in private or whether it's in closed sessions. You really need to not ignore conflict, especially if it's within members of your association. Okay. Remember that meetings take time and energy. Meetings are effective when managed well. I'm a big believer in that. I'm a big believer that there is going to be conflict in meetings, but if it's addressed immediately, you're going to have success with it. You can be really good with conflict. In our lives, many of us run from conflict. Most of my jobs, I've run to conflict. Address it, deal with it. Don't let it fester, because it won't end well. Okay. And keep in mind, there are going to be people who may attempt to hijack the meeting. That's just a part of life. But if you're prepared for it, you're going to deal with it very well. And most people that I have dealt with who have hijacked meetings, when I've sat down with them and spoken to them, we have shaken hands and had a cup of coffee and walked away feeling good about it, because that's what it's about. It's not about batting heads. It's really about, hey, look, what is it? You're very passionate about something here, and you're wanting to discuss this point. Maybe not in this meeting, but let's do it over a cup of coffee, or let's sit down and talk about this, because I think I can listen to you very well here, and I can hear what you're saying, and I think we can move forward on this. So like I said, 99%, and you're talking to an ex-dean of students where I dealt with conflict on a daily basis, and 99.9% of the time when I sat down with somebody who was hijacking a disciplinary meeting or attempting to, and we had a nice professional civil conversation, we walked away shaking hands. Matter of fact, I'll give you a case study. I had a student one time who threatened to kill me and 4 other people at the college, and I could have easily expelled him, but I made an attempt to bring him in the office and said, look, if you sit down with me and we have this conversation, he kept trying to hijack the meeting with death threats. And after about an hour of conversation, we finally got down to having a civil conversation between 2 adults and discussing what needed to happen, discussing the mental health that he needed to get. We shook hands and we moved forward. And later on, I saw him and he told me later on, about a year later, he said, thank you so much for being respectful and listening to me. I said, yeah, no problem. Now, I took that effort because I believe in sitting down with people and hearing them out and listening to them, especially when they're angry and upset about something. So very important things to keep in mind. Okay. Recommendations for you all in hosting meetings: keep well-documented meeting minutes. Very important, not just for you, but for everybody else who may want to know what happened in that meeting. If you're going to have long meetings, I highly suggest recommend drinks, food, or and you could buy protein bars. A lot of my meetings, I would always bring protein bars and maybe some fruit. And sometimes it was out of my pocket. Other times it was out of the budget of whatever entity I was hosting the meeting with. I'm not advocating that you spend money out of your own pocket if you don't have it, but having drinks and food for, when I say a long meeting, if it's a meeting between 6 and 8 o'clock and people are coming from work, they're probably going to be hungry. They may not have eaten. And so you might want to have something. Or the other thing I used to do is I used to go out and I used to ask businesses that were in my neighborhood association boundaries, hey, would you be willing to donate some protein bars? Would you be willing to donate some bottled water? And 99% of the time, they would say, sure, no problem, Rudy. What do you need? How
Rudy,
about a
that's
case?
fantastic. I don't mean to interrupt. I was just going to
Sure.
interject and suggest that, because I know a lot of neighborhood associations previously, were able to charge dues, and now with the updated neighborhood ordinance, dues are now voluntary. So that's been a question and a concern. And I was just going to say, another suggestion for neighborhood folks is to reach out to neighborhood businesses, if you have them in your area, and ask them if they would be willing to donate. I mean, it's not only a great way to make that connection with local businesses, it's a potential way to grow your membership, because you can, invite
Sure.
if you have businesses to join your neighborhood association. But it's a really great, another good way for neighborhood associations to make larger connections and to get
Right.
food and drink donated.
Exactly, Vanessa. It's great community building. And I would always tell the people who would donate, hey, I am going to make sure if you're in the boundaries of our neighborhood. So saying, come to the meeting. If you don't want to come, no problem, but I will make sure that you're acknowledged for the donation. And when you think about it, a case of bottled water at Costco is $4. Sometimes a business would say, hey, Rudy, how many cases of water do you need? And I would say, well, I'm going to have, gosh, could you give me 10 cases? And they would laugh and say, if it's $40, Rudy, I'm going to give you 15 cases of water, no problem. As long if you want to pick them up. And so I have no qualms asking folks for, hey, would you be willing to donate something? The only thing they can say is no, and I'm okay with that. But 99% of the time, most they would always say, sure, what do you need? And I was realistic about it, but they're really, really, and I like building the partnerships with the different businesses and entities, like I said, whether it's faith-based or nonprofit that are within our boundaries. Because one, they were within our neighborhood boundaries, and I like to be inclusive and I like to do things with them. And two, I'm really interested in knowing more about what they do. So that's helpful for our board meetings, that if we ever have to partner with anything, but I would always ask for donations, and most of the time I would get them. So something to keep in mind. The other recommendation is celebrate accomplishments. Very rarely in a neighborhood association Do we celebrate accomplishments? And that could be anything from, hey, we got some new speed signs. Hey, let's have a little celebration, to, hey, we did something bigger. We did this. Very rarely do we celebrate our accomplishments. It's always more about focusing on other things. And so as we wrap up here, summary, identify the purpose of the meeting. We spoke about that. Choose your stakeholders wisely. Make sure that you have an agenda, because that is your task list for the work you're going to do in the meeting, and it reduces the chances for conflict over the meeting's nuts and bolts. Those ground rules are so important to support mutual respect and comfort. Maintain civility and meeting discipline with the ground rules. As I said earlier, there were three things I always try to make sure I have in my meeting: the purpose, the agenda, and the ground rules. So important. And then followed by minutes and the logistics of the meeting. And keep in mind that the work that occurs at a meeting is important, needs to be recorded. That's where the minutes come in here. So very, very important things to do. I normally do this in person, and if we were doing this in an in-person training, I would have you basically, based on this exercise, I would have you actually develop an agenda, ground rules. I would have you talk about stakeholders, how long the meeting would last, et cetera. It's a nice little exercise to get people into the groove of developing the agenda, the ground rules, and some of the meeting logistics, but it can be difficult to do in Zoom. So at this point, I'd like to entertain any questions.
I don't see any questions, Rudy. There was a comment that was typed into the chat. I did make a few comments myself. Alex Klebanow, who is with the West Mesa Neighborhood Association, had typed in a comment talking about, he said how they get feedback at their meetings is at West Mesa Neighborhood Association, they have what is called an issue box.
Oh, good.
People can write down issues, and then we get in touch with them outside of the meeting to discuss it before bringing it to the meeting. They don't allow distraction from the agenda. So I thought that was a really good suggestion.
Nice. That is a good suggestion. Thank you for putting that out there.
Yeah. And then I had typed a few suggestions in as well, just from my own experiences from attending the many neighborhood association meetings I have. Something to consider when you are looking at who you're inviting is timing. And I say this specific to if you're inviting a city councilor or another city, like a city department leader, if you can give them as much advance lead time as possible, that's going to be really crucial in being sure you're going to get them. I've been invited to several neighborhood association meetings with maybe like literally 1 day advance notice, and I can tell you that it's almost impossible to do it on that short of notice, just because of workloads, and people do have lives outside of work. So that's just another suggestion, is if you're going to be having a meeting, like an important meeting, like an annual meeting, and you want someone there, your counselor, your county commissioner, a department head, please try and give them at least a month if you possibly can. So that was my other suggestion. And then another suggestion I had was for neighborhood associations that have more than one meeting per year, like if they have a monthly meeting or a quarterly meeting. It's really, really helpful to try and maintain consistency in terms of date and time and location. So for example, if you have a monthly meeting, you should really consider holding it on the same, like the second Tuesday of every month. Or if you have a quarterly meeting, you have it on the third Thursday of the third month of the year. And try to maintain consistency in location, try to maintain consistency of time. You're really going to get a lot more retention and people attending if people know where and when this meeting is on a regular basis. So just a couple of things that I wanted to suggest to people, just my own experiences from working with neighborhood association folks.
And that's important. No, I was going to say, Vanessa, I'm glad you said those 2 points. And that's the reason our neighborhood association has kept consistency. We have monthly meetings. And as I said earlier, it's every second Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. So it's just it never changes. And it never changes locations. Also about inviting people to your meeting, I just want to piggyback what Vanessa said. Last month or I think it was earlier this month at National Night Out, I ran into the deputy director for Albuquerque Community Safety, ACS, and I asked him, hey, we'd like you to come to our September. So I was inviting him to our September board meeting a month and a quarter out so that he could put it in his calendar, and he was happy to do so. But Vanessa's so correct on that. I always try to make sure that if I'm bringing people to our board meeting, it's at least a month out, especially government, city, state type folks.
Yeah. And I know that is maybe not always a possibility for people, but even if you can give somebody at least, as much lead time as you possibly can, it really, really helps. So just another suggestion. And then there's another comment that was typed in from Jane Backley. Jane is with the Santa Fe Village Neighborhood Association. Jane typed in, at Santa Fe Village, we have an agenda item called Resident Forum with a specific time limit. And she had a comment about it. She's intrigued by the idea of using a meeting evaluation checklist as a way of following up with residents who attend meetings, especially at meetings of the board. And I would have to say I agree with you. If you have a way of kind of taking the pulse of meetings and kind of seeing what works and what doesn't, I think that's a really great way to make determinations of what is going to work for your association moving forward and what does not, because I think we would all agree there's not one cut and dry way of doing things in any neighborhood association. What works for one association in terms of meetings may not work for someone else. So I that's a very good observation that you made, Jane.
Yeah, Jane, thanks for, and the handouts, I was going to speak briefly to them. There's, I think I gave you
There were
five sets of handouts, right?
And I did email them to everybody, but if anyone didn't get them or wants other additional copies, I'm happy to send those. Just let me know. Just send me an email.
And they're self-explanatory, but the meeting evaluation checklist, that's the one handout that I wanted to make sure you receive, because you can use that for your meetings. And you know what? Add to it, delete from it, create your own checklist. It's nothing more than a tool that you can modify to work better for you. And I apologize because the one handout where I was talking about the checklist, that graphic was not clear. It's a little bit fuzzy. And I didn't realize that till I was looking at it, and I thought it was my glasses. Then I looked closer and I said, "Oh no, that was my slide." So my apologies on that. I thought my vision was going. So for those of you who thought the same thing I did, your vision is not going. It was my bad slide.
Did anyone else have any other questions or best practices that they wanted to share in the chat?
And Vanessa, what's nice, I love reading what people are doing at in other neighborhoods. So because you guys are doing some great stuff, and
yes,
as Vanessa said, best practices. It's so nice to see everything you're doing, and it's nice that at some point it'll be great to share it with other neighborhood associations so they can learn what maybe Santa Fe Village NA is doing, or whether West Side's doing. All these neat things that you guys are doing that can help other people improve what they're doing.
And it provides a really good way for neighborhoods to make connections amongst one another, because like you said, Rudy, if one neighborhood association is doing something that maybe they can teach to another neighborhood association, it can help people from reinventing the wheel. And I think it's important to remember, meetings at their heart is a group of people coming together because they want to affect positive change for their city. And I think it's important to remind people of that, because oftentimes, we do see conflicts at meetings, we do see conflicts among members. And I think I always try to remind people, if you're in a neighborhood association, you're probably on the same page as your other neighborhood association folks. You maybe are going about it different ways. Maybe you're trying to accomplish your goal in a different way, but just remember that you're when it comes down to it, we're all on the same team. When we're in a neighborhood association, we want a clean neighborhood, we want an aesthetically pleasing neighborhood, we want a safe neighborhood, and we want a neighborhood that has economic growth. And so it's important to just remember that, even if you do have differences of opinion or conflicts with other neighborhood association folks, that just remember you really in the end are all on the same page. And that's why you're coming together to have these meetings, and that's why we're doing these trainings, is to give you the tools to have effective meetings.
And I'm glad you said that, Vanessa, because I'm a big believer in kindness. I'm a kindness guy. When I don't waste a lot of my time on negativity because it just drains me. I'm always looking at the positive side of things. And, we're neighborhood associations, neighborhoods are small communities within the larger community. As Vanessa said, we're all in it together. We want safe neighborhoods. We want, to be happy in our neighborhoods, in our city. We all are wanting the same thing. And so I think that as neighborhood association member volunteers, we're all working hard to do that together. And I'll say it again, it's so nice when you're sharing these kind of things that you're doing, because it helps other neighborhood associations say, hey, if that's what they're doing, maybe I'll try it in my neighbor. And I'll say this, and I'll say it based on not just my experience as dean of students, but I was also an emergency medical technician here in the city. So I dealt with behaviors in a lot of different ways. Most people are not mean people. Most people are not mean. Most people oftentimes, and I'll say this as dean of students, when I was dealing with behaviors, they're angry, they're upset about something, and they just want to be heard. And if you're able to sit down with somebody and listen to them and listen to their issue, their problem, I can guarantee you're going to walk away shaking hands. And you may have to tell them, look, I've just heard what you said, and I'm not going to be able to fix this right away, but I will see if I can address it. The outcome may not be what you're expecting, but I'm going to try. At least you've heard them, you've listened to them. And in most of my experience, most people say, well, thank you. And this is what they'll typically say, thank you for listening to me. And
Yep.
so I've always thought that goes a lot further than doing this.
Yep, for sure. And Nadine, thank you for the comment. Nadine said she appreciated the timeliness of this as they're returning to in-person meetings. And just a reminder that the tools that Dr. Garcia has shared with us and the suggestions that I typed into the chat, those can be applied to Zoom meetings and online meetings as well as in-person meetings. So just remember that, you may have to slightly adjust your format, but everything today that was discussed can be translated to either a face-to-face meeting or an online meeting. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, if there are no more comments or questions, I'm going to wrap up the training. Dr. Garcia, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be with us again. I really appreciate the trainings that you give our neighborhood of folks. I've gotten nothing but positive feedback, and it's just, these are very valuable tools for people to have. Running a neighborhood association, as we know, is not an easy job, and it can be thankless at times. So I think the more tools and capacity that people have to have effective meetings and to go out and recruit new people, it does nothing but help. So thank you for that. And thank you to all of our attendees. Appreciate you taking the time out of your busy work days. Next month, we're going to be doing another training. Dr. Garcia will be part of that, but it's going to focus on neighborhood emergency safety and how to form neighborhood safety patrols. So I think that's going to be a topic of great interest to people. So I'll be sending out the information probably in September, and I'm looking forward to having as many people sign up as possible. So Dr. Garcia, thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa, and thank you to the attendees. You guys are doing great work in your neighborhood and your associations, and keep it up. Like I said, we're all volunteers trying to do a good thing and create a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. You all have a great rest of your day. This will be posted on the ONC's YouTube channel probably at the end of today, and I will include it in Monday's e-news so everybody will have access. And just email me if you need additional handouts or if you need a copy of the presentation that Dr. Garcia gave today. And you all have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye, Vanessa.